Chapter 9 of Malcolm Sage Detective by Herbert George Jenkins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 9 The Holding Up of Lady Glanedale 1. "More trouble, Tommy," remarked Gladys Norman one morning as James Thompson entered her room. He looked across at her quickly, a keen flash of interest in his somnolent brown eyes. "Somebody's pinched Lady Glanedale's jewels. Just had a telephone message. What a happy place the world would be without drink and crime." "And women," added Thompson, alert of eye, and prepared to dodge anything that was coming. "Tommy, you're a beast. Get the hens." And, bending over her typewriter, she became absorbed in rattling words onto paper. Thompson had just reached the third line of "I'm sorry I made you cry," when his quick eye detected Malcolm Sage as he entered the outer office. With a brief "Good morning," Malcolm Sage passed into his room, and a minute later Gladys Norman was reading from her notebook the message that had come over the telephone to the effect that early that morning a burglar had entered Lady Glanedale's bedroom at the Home Park, Histon, the country house of Sir Roger Glanedale, and, under threat from a pistol, had demanded her jewel case, which she had accordingly handed to him. As the jewels were insured with the 20th Century Insurance Corporation Limited, Malcolm Sage had been immediately communicated with, that he might take up the enquiry with a view to tracing the missing property. One of Malcolm Sage's first cases had been undertaken for this company in connection with a burglary. He had been successful in restoring the whole of the missing property. In consequence, he had been personally thanked by the chairman at a fully attended board meeting, and at the same time presented with a gold-mounted walking stick, which, as he remarked to Sir John Dene, no one but a drum major in full dress would dare to carry. Having listened carefully as she read her notes, Malcolm Sage dismissed Gladys Norman with a nod, and for some minutes sat at his table, drawing the inevitable diagrams upon his blotting pad. Presently he rose and walked over to a row of shelves filled with red-backed volumes, lettered on the back "Records," with a number and a date. Every crime or curious occurrence that came under Malcolm Sage's notice was duly chronicled in the pages of these volumes, which contained miles of press cuttings. They were rendered additionally valuable by an elaborate system of cross-reference indexing. After referring to an index volume, Malcolm Sage selected one of the folios and returned with it to his table. Rapidly turning over the pages, he came to a newspaper cutting which was dated some 5 weeks previously. This he read and pondered over for some time. It ran: "Daring burglary. Country mansion entered. Burglar's sang-froid. In the early hours of yesterday morning a daring burglary was committed at the Dower House near Histon, the residence of Mr. Gerald Comminge, who was away from home at the time, by which the burglar was able to make a rich haul of jewels. In the early hours of the morning Mrs. Comminge was awakened by the presence of a man in her room. As she sat up in bed, the man turned an electric torch upon her and, pointing a revolver in her direction, warned her that if she cried out he would shoot. He then demanded to know where she kept her jewels, and Mrs. Comminge, too terrified to do anything else, indicated a drawer in which lay her jewel case. Taking the jewel case and putting it under his arm, the man threatened that if she moved or called out within a quarter of an hour, he would return and shoot her. He then got out of the window onto a small balcony and disappeared. It seems that he gained admittance by clambering up some ivy and thus onto the narrow balcony that runs the length of one side of the house. Immediately on the man's disappearance, Mrs. Comminge fainted. On coming to, she gave the alarm, and the police were immediately telephoned for. Although the man's footprints are easily discernible upon the mould and the soft turf, the culprit seems to have left no other clue. The description that Mrs. Comminge is able to give of her assailant is rather lacking in detail, owing to the shock she experienced at his sudden appearance. It would appear that the man is of medium height and slight of build. He wore a cap and a black handkerchief tied across his face just beneath his eyes, which entirely masked his features. With this very inadequate description of the ruffian, the police have perforce to set to work upon the very difficult task of tracing him." For some time Malcolm Sage pondered over the cutting. Then, rising, he replaced the volume and rang for Thompson. An hour later Tims was carrying him along in the direction of Sir Roger Glanedale's house at a good 35 miles an hour. The Home Park was an Elizabethan mansion that had been acquired by Sir Roger Glanedale out of enormous profits made upon the sale of margarine. As Tims brought the car up before the front entrance with an impressive sweep, the hall door was thrown open by the butler, who habitually strove by an excessive dignity of demeanour to remove from his mental palate the humiliating flavour of margarine. Malcolm Sage's card considerably mitigated the impression made upon Mr. Hibbs's mind by the swing with which Tims had brought the car up to the door. Malcolm Sage was shown into the morning room and told that her ladyship would see him in a few minutes. He was busy in the contemplation of the garden when the door opened and Lady Glanedale entered. He bowed, and then, as Lady Glanedale seated herself at a small table, he took the nearest chair. She was a little woman, some 8 inches too short for the air she assumed, fair, good-looking, but with a hard, set mouth. No one had ever permitted her to forget that she had married margarine. "You have called about the burglary?" she enquired, in a tone she might have adopted to a plumber who had come to see to a leak in the bath. Malcolm Sage bowed. "Perhaps you will give me the details," he said. "Kindly be as brief as possible," his incipient Bolshevism manifesting itself in his manner. Lady Glanedale elevated her eyebrows, but as Malcolm Sage's eyes were not upon her, she proceeded to tell her story. "About 1 o'clock this morning I was awakened to find a man in my bedroom," she began. "He was standing between the bedstead and the farther window, his face masked. He had a pistol in one hand, which he pointed towards me, and an electric torch in the other. I sat up in bed and stared at him. 'If you call out I shall kill you,' he said. I asked him what he wanted. He replied that if I gave him my jewel case and did not call for help, he would not do me any harm. Realizing that I was helpless, I got out of bed, put on a wrapper, opened a small safe I have set in the wall, and handed him one of the 2 jewel cases I possess. He then made me promise that I would not ring or call out for a quarter of an hour, and he disappeared out of the window. At the end of a quarter of an hour I summoned help, and my stepson, the butler, and several other servants came to my room. We telephoned for the police, and after breakfast we telephoned to the insurance company." For fully a minute there was silence. Malcolm Sage decided that Lady Glanedale certainly possessed the faculty of telling a story with all the events in their proper sequence. He found himself with very few questions to put to her. "Can you describe the man?" he asked, as he mechanically turned over the leaves of a book on a table beside him. "Not very well," she replied. "I saw little more than a silhouette against the window. He was of medium height, slight of build, and I should say young." "That seems to agree with the description of the man who robbed Mrs. Comminge," he said as if to himself. "That is what the inspector said," remarked Lady Glanedale. "His voice?" "Was rather husky, as if he were trying to disguise it." "Was it the voice of a man of refinement or otherwise?" "I should describe it as middle class," was the snobbish response. "The mask?" "It looked like a silk handkerchief tied across his nose. It was dark in tone, but I could get only a dim impression." Malcolm Sage inclined his head comprehendingly. "You know Mrs. Comminge?" "Intimately." "You mentioned 2 jewel cases," he said. "The one stolen contained those I mostly wear," replied Lady Glanedale. "In the other I keep some very valuable family jewels." "What was the value of those stolen?" "About £8,000, she replied. "Possibly more. I should explain, perhaps, that Sir Roger was staying in town last night, and so far I have not been able to get him on the telephone. He was to have stayed at the Ritzton, but apparently he found them full and went elsewhere." "You have no suspicion as to who it was that entered your room?" "None whatever," said Lady Glanedale. "The police have already been?" he enquired, as he examined with great intentness a rose he had taken from a bowl beside him. "Yes, they came shortly after we telephoned. They gave instructions that nothing was to be touched in the room, and no one was to go near the ground beneath the windows." Malcolm Sage nodded approvingly and returned the rose to the bowl. "And now," he said, "I think I should like to see the room. By the way, I take it that you keep your safe locked?" "Always," said Lady Glanedale. "Where do you keep the key?" "In the bottom right hand drawer of my dressing table, under a pile of handkerchiefs." "As soon as you can, I should like to see a list of the jewels," said Malcolm Sage, as he followed Lady Glanedale towards the door. "My maid is copying it out now," she replied, and led the way up the staircase, along a heavily carpeted corridor, at the end of which she threw open a door giving access to a bedroom. Malcolm Sage entered and gave a swift look about him, seeming to note and catalogue every detail. It was a large room, with 2 windows looking out on to a lawn. On the right was a door which, Lady Glanedale explained, led to Sir Roger's dressing room. He walked over to the window near the dressing room and looked out. "That is the window he must have entered by. He went out that way," explained Lady Glanedale. "You spoke of a stepson," said Malcolm Sage. "He is a man, I presume?" "He is 23." Lady Glanedale elevated her eyebrows as if surprised at the question. "Can you send for him?" "Certainly, if you wish it." She rang the bell, and a moment later requested the maid who answered it to ask Mr. Robert to come immediately. "Do you sleep with lowered blinds?" enquired Malcolm Sage. "The one nearest my bed I always keep down. The other I pull up after putting out my light." "Did you awaken suddenly, or gradually, as if it were your usual time to awaken?" "It was gradual," said Lady Glanedale, after a pause for thought. "I remember having the feeling that someone was looking at me." "Was the light from the torch shining on your face?" "No, it was turned to the opposite side of the room, on my right, as I lay in bed." At that moment a young man in tweeds entered. "You want me, mater?" he enquired. Then, looking across at Malcolm Sage with a slightly troubled shadow in his eyes, he bowed. "This is Mr. Sage from the insurance company," said Lady Glanedale coldly. "He wishes to see you." Again there was the slightly troubled look in young Glanedale's eyes. "Perhaps you will place Mr. Glanedale in the exact position in which the man was standing when you first saw him," said Malcolm Sage. Without a word, Lady Glanedale walked over to the spot she had indicated, young Glanedale following. When she had got him into the desired position, she turned interrogatingly to Malcolm Sage. "Now," he said, "will you be so kind as to lie on your bed in the same position in which you were when you awakened?" For a moment Lady Glanedale's eyebrows indicated surprise. She used her eyebrows more than any other feature for the purpose of expressing emotion. Without comment, however, she lay down upon the bed on her right side, closed her eyes, then, a moment later, sat up and gazed in the direction where Glanedale stood looking awkward and self-conscious. "Perhaps you will repeat every movement you made," said Malcolm Sage. "Try to open the safe door exactly as you did then, and leave it at the same angle. Every detail is important." Lady Glanedale rose, picked up a wrapper that was lying over a chair back, put it on, and, walking over to the safe, turned the key that was in the lock and opened it. Then, standing between the safe and Glanedale, she took out a jewel case and closed the door. Finally, she walked over to where her stepson stood and handed him the jewel case. "Thank you," said Malcolm Sage. "I wanted to see whether or not the man had the opportunity of seeing into the safe." "I took care to stand in front of it," she said. "So I observed. You allowed the quarter of an hour to elapse before you raised the alarm?" "Certainly, I had promised," was the response. "But a promise extorted by threats of violence is not binding," he suggested, as he pulled meditatively at his right ear. "It is with me," was the cold retort. He inclined his head slightly. "I notice that the ground beneath the windows has been roped off." "The inspector thought it had better be done, as there were footprints." "I will not trouble you further for the present, Lady Glanedale," said Malcolm Sage, moving towards the door. "I should like to spend a little time in the grounds. Later I may require to interrogate the servants." Young Glanedale opened the door, and his stepmother, followed by Malcolm Sage, passed out. They descended the stairs together. "Please don't trouble to come out," said Malcolm Sage. "I shall probably be some little time." This as Lady Glanedale moved towards the hall door. "By the way," he said, as she turned towards the morning room where she had received him, "did you happen to notice if the man was wearing boots, or was he in stockinged feet?" "I think he wore boots," she said, after a momentary pause. "Thank you," and Malcolm Sage turned towards the door, which was held open by the butler. Passing down the steps and to the left, he walked round to the side of the house where the space immediately beneath Lady Glanedale's windows had been roped off. Stepping over the protecting rope, he examined the ground beneath the window through which the burglar had entered. Running along the side of the house was a flower bed some 2 feet 6 inches wide, and on its surface was clearly indicated a series of footprints. On the side of the painted water pipe were scratches such as might have been made by someone climbing up to the window above. Drawing a spring metal rule from his pocket, he proceeded to take a series of measurements, which he jotted down in a notebook. He next examined the water pipe up which the man presumably had climbed, and presently passed on to a similar pipe farther to the left. Every inch of ground he subjected to a careful and elaborate examination, lifting the lower branches of some evergreens and gazing beneath them. Finally, closing his notebook with a snap, Malcolm Sage seated himself upon a garden seat and, carefully filling and lighting his pipe, he became absorbed in the polished pinkness of the third finger-nail of his left hand. A quarter of an hour later he was joined by young Glanedale. "Found anything?" he enquired. "There are some footprints," said Malcolm Sage, looking at him keenly. "By the way, what did you do when you heard of the robbery?" "I went to the mater's room." "And after that?" "I rushed downstairs and started looking about." "You didn't happen to come anywhere near this spot, or walk upon the mould there?" He nodded at the place he had just been examining. "No, as a matter of fact I avoided it. The mater warned me to be careful." Malcolm Sage nodded his head. "Did the butler join you in your search?" he enquired. "About 5 minutes later he did. He had to go back and put on some things. He was rather sketchy when he turned up in the mater's room." Glanedale grinned at the recollection. "And you?" Malcolm Sage flashed on him that steel grey look of interrogation. For a moment the young man seemed embarrassed, and he hesitated before replying. "As a matter of fact, I hadn't turned in," he said at length. "I see," said Malcolm Sage, and there was something in his tone that caused Glanedale to look at him quickly. "It was such a ripping night that I sat at my bedroom window smoking," he explained a little nervously. "Which is your bedroom window?" Glanedale nodded in the direction of the farther end of the house. "That's the governor's dressing room," he said, indicating the window on the left of that through which the burglar had escaped. "And the next is mine." "Did you see anything?" enquired Malcolm Sage, who, having unscrewed the mouthpiece of his pipe, proceeded to clean it with a blade of grass. Again there was the slightest suggestion of hesitation before Glanedale replied. "No, nothing. You see," he added hastily, "I was not looking out of the window, merely sitting at it. As a matter of fact, I was facing the other way." "You heard no noise?" Glanedale shook his head. "So that the first intimation you had of anything being wrong was what?" he asked. "I heard the mater at the door calling for assistance, and I went immediately." Malcolm Sage turned and regarded the water pipe speculatively. "I wonder if anyone really could climb up that," he said. "I'm sure I couldn't." "Nothing easier," said Glanedale. "I could shin up in 2 ticks," and he made a movement towards the pipe. "No," said Malcolm Sage, putting a detaining hand upon his arm. "If you want to demonstrate your agility, try the other. There are marks on this I want to preserve." "Right-o!" cried Glanedale with a laugh, and a moment later he was shinning up the further pipe with the agility of a South Sea Islander after coconuts. Malcolm Sage walked towards the pipe, glanced at it, and then at the footprints beneath. "You were quite right," he remarked casually. Then a moment later he enquired, "Do you usually sit up late?" "We're not exactly early birds," Glanedale replied a little irrelevantly. "The mater plays a lot of bridge, you know," he added. "And that keeps you out of bed?" "Yes and no," was the reply. "I can't afford to play with the Mater's crowd, but I have to hang about until after they've gone. The governor hates it. You see," he added confidentially, "when a man's had to make his money, he knows the value of it." "True," said Malcolm Sage, but from the look in his eyes his thoughts seemed elsewhere. "By the way, what time was it that you had a shower here last night?" "A shower?" repeated Glanedale. "Oh, yes, I remember. It was just about 12 o'clock. It only lasted about 10 minutes." "I'll think things over," said Malcolm Sage, and Glanedale, taking the hint, strolled off towards the house. Malcolm Sage walked over to where an old man was trimming a hedge. "Could you lend me a trowel for half an hour?" he enquired. "No, dang it, I can't," growled the old fellow. "I ain't a going to lend no more trowels or anything else." "Why?" enquired Malcolm Sage. "There's my best trowel gone out of the tool house," he grumbled, "and I ain't a going to lend no others." "How did it go?" "How should I know?" he complained. "Walked out, I suppose, same as trowels is always doing." "When did you miss it?" "'Twas there day before yesterday, I'll swear, and I ain't a going to lend no more." "Do you think the man who took the jewels stole it?" enquired Malcolm Sage. "Dang the jewels," he retorted. "I want my trowel." And, grumbling to himself, the old fellow shuffled off to the other end of the hedge. Half an hour later Malcolm Sage was in Hyston, interviewing the inspector of police, who was incoherent with excitement. He learned that Scotland Yard was sending down a man that afternoon. Furthermore, that elaborate enquiries were being made in the neighbourhood as to any suspicious characters having recently been seen. Malcolm Sage asked a number of questions, to which he received more or less impatient replies. The inspector was convinced that the robbery was the work of the same man who had got away with Mrs. Comminge's jewels, and he was impatient with anyone who did not share this view. From the police station Malcolm Sage went to the Painted Flag, where, having ordered lunch, he got through to the 20th Century Insurance Corporation and made an appointment to meet one of the assessors at Home Park at 3 o'clock. End of chapter 9.